I have nothing left except the clothes on my back and a photograph of my babies." The words tore out of Mia Morales before she could stop them, raw and broken like a voice that had forgotten how to speak hope. The night was winter-sharp and clear. November in San Francisco, and the sky above Giovanni Russo's estate hung thick with stars, each one diamond bright against the absolute black, frost coating every surface like a curse that could not be erased. 11:47 p.m. The iron gates of the mansion glowed under streetlights, and beyond them, a circular driveway where expensive cars gleamed like sleeping predators. Mia pulled up in her 10-year-old Honda with a food delivery on the passenger seat. 2 pasta dinners, garlic bread, a bottle of wine that cost more than she had eaten in the last 4 days. The restaurant had paid her $43 cash for the run, cash she needed desperately, and she held the job only because the owner did not ask questions about her address or background. She saw her immediately. An older woman walking toward a black Mercedes, moving with the careful steps of someone who had never known struggle. Isabella Russo wore a cream-colored coat and held a small leather purse, her silver hair catching the streetlight like a halo. Elegant. Untouchable. Everything Mia would never be. Mia stepped out of her car, the December wind tearing at her thin jacket, and that was when her eyes caught something that made her entire body go rigid. Metallic. Underneath the Mercedes. A shape. A device. Something strapped to the chassis that did not belong to any engine manufactured in any year. Mia's mind did not have time to process. Her body moved faster than thought. Her legs screamed against the frozen ground as she ran, food bags forgotten, flying open on the asphalt behind her. She opened her mouth and screamed. The sound came from somewhere animal and primal, a delivery driver's voice that had no authority, no power, just raw desperation. She screamed at a woman she had never met, at a situation she did not understand, at a danger that was 30 seconds away from becoming irreversible. Isabella turned. For one frozen moment, their eyes met. The old woman's face registered confusion, then alarm as she watched this girl in a stained delivery jacket sprinting toward her like her life depended on it. Mia's legs pumped harder. 10 feet. 8 feet. She could smell the frost in the air, could hear her own breath tearing through her chest. 6 feet. She launched herself forward, a human projectile moving with nothing but terrified love for a stranger, and drove her shoulder into Isabella Russo's ribs with every ounce of strength her starving body possessed. They hit the frozen ground together. 3 seconds later, the world became fire. The explosion detonated with a sound like thunder wrapped in violence, a percussion so absolute it stopped time itself. The black Mercedes erupted into a fireball that climbed 50 feet into the San Francisco night, orange and red and white hot, consuming everything. Glass from every window on the north face of the mansion shattered simultaneously and rained down like diamonds made of death, glittering and lethal, thousands of shards descending onto the circular driveway. Mia covered Isabella's body completely, her worn jacket absorbing the impact of falling glass, her hands protecting the old woman's head, her entire being becoming a shield against a fire that had tried to steal a life. The heat was unbearable. The smell of burning leather and gasoline and melted rubber choked the air. Her ears rang with a frequency that seemed to come from inside her own skull. She did not move. For 10 seconds, 20, 30, she lay there on the frozen ground with Isabella Russo's trembling body beneath hers, both of them covered in soot and frost, the Mercedes still burning, still consuming itself in the November night. Then footsteps. Running. Multiple sets, coordinated, the sound of a security apparatus activated. The front doors of the mansion burst open. Giovanni Russo emerged first, and behind him, 2 men in black suits with hands already moving toward holstered weapons. Tony and Enzo. His lieutenants for the last 15 years. Both trained in violence, both prepared for everything. Both utterly unprepared for what they saw. A homeless-looking delivery driver, filthy, bleeding from where glass had cut her shoulders, her body wrapped around the most important woman in Giovanni's world. An act of protection. An act of love from a complete stranger. An act that made no sense in a world that understood only power and survival and the cold mathematics of self-preservation. Giovanni Russo, 48 years old, built like a monument, with a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone and eyes that had witnessed every form of human cruelty, stood absolutely still. In 15 years of ruling an empire built on revenge, he had never seen anything like this. Mia raised her head slowly, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her entire body shaking not from cold but from adrenaline that had nowhere to go. She looked at the man with the scar, at the two silent men in suits, at the burning car behind her that should have taken Isabella's life. She did not know who he was. She did not know that her actions in the next 10 seconds would change everything. She did not know that upstairs, in a second-floor window, a 6-year-old girl named Emma Russo was watching, her small hand pressed against the glass, her young heart already beginning to recognize something in this stranger that looked like salvation. What changed everything was silence. The silence after the explosion. The silence after the rescue. The silence of a moment so profound that even the winter wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Tony moved forward, kneeling beside both women, checking Isabella for injuries with the efficiency of someone trained to respond to crisis. But it was Giovanni who extended his hand to help Mia up. Giovanni, the most powerful mafia boss in San Francisco, whose name meant death to some and protection to others, whose word was law in a world that operated outside the law, offered his scarred hand to a girl in a torn jacket who had $5 to her name. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever wondered whether one person can actually change another person's life, this is the story for you. Now let us go back to the beginning to understand how a delivery driver with nothing in the world could end up shielding a mafia boss's mother from a car bomb. Let us go back 3 days earlier, to a moment when Mia Morales still believed her story was one of slow extinction. The fluorescent lights hummed their dying song. 3:22 in the morning. The all-night diner on 5th and Market was nearly empty, just Mia and a man in a security uniform sleeping in a booth by the window, his head tilted back, his mouth slightly open. The black and white checkered floor, the stale smell of coffee and grease hanging heavy in the silence, the sound of ice melting in half-empty glasses, it all pressed down on her like the weight of every decision that had brought her to this exact moment. She sat in a corner booth, her back to the wall, a habit she had learned from watching other homeless people in shelters, always positioning yourself so you could see what came next. In front of her sat 2 objects that represented the complete inventory of her life. A crumpled foreclosure notice, the edges worn soft from being folded and unfolded 100 times. $85,000. That was the number that haunted her. $85,000 in debt after the fire at the shelter, after Derek had decided that if he could not control her, he would burn down the roof over her head. And in her other trembling hand, $5. One $5 bill and some change that added up to maybe another 40 cents. $5 and change. That was everything. Mia's hands were calloused from delivery work, her fingernails broken and dirt-stained, her wrists thin enough that you could see the veins mapping their way toward her heart. She was 27 years old but carried the appearance of someone a decade older, eyes hollowed by exhaustion, skin marked by the toll of sleeping in a car during San Francisco's cold months, hair that she washed in gas station bathrooms when she could afford the money for soap. She owned exactly the clothes on her back. A delivery jacket with a logo that had faded after 2 years of constant wear. Jeans with a hole in the right knee that she had never had time to repair. A thermal shirt underneath that she had purchased at a discount store for $3. Shoes held together with duct tape and desperation. And she owned a photograph. A single 4x6 print that she kept in her jacket pocket, the edges soft from being touched 1,000 times, the colors fading but still visible. 2 babies. Her daughters. 2 years old and 3 years old in the photo, their faces bright with a happiness that their mother could no longer find in the world. They lived with her sister in Portland now. She hadn't seen them in 4 months. The sound of the diner door opening made Mia look up. A man walked in, early 60s, face weathered like old leather, eyes that had seen too much. He carried the smell of cigarette smoke and broken promises. He ordered black coffee from the waitress and did not look at Mia. She went back to staring at the foreclosure notice. The fire had happened 9 weeks ago. Derek Collins, her ex-boyfriend, the man she had escaped from twice and been dragged back to twice, had come to the shelter at midnight with a can of gasoline and a rage that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. He had doused her backpack, the one with her documents, her children's birth certificates, her social security card, every proof that she had ever existed in an official capacity, and set it on fire. Then he had burned down half the shelter. 3 families lost everything that night. 2 corrupt cops, the ones Derek paid $200 a week to ensure that her restraining order never actually protected anything, had taken her statement and done nothing. She had called them 7 times in the weeks after the fire. 7 times they had not returned her calls. The city had begun eviction proceedings against her for the apartment she could no longer afford. Hence the foreclosure notice. Hence the $85,000 that might as well have been $850 million because she had no way to pay it. Hence the $5. She had been doing delivery work for a restaurant called Lucia's, cash payment at the end of each shift. The owner, a woman named Rosa who asked no questions, paid her $40 to $50 per night. Mia delivered between the hours of 8 p.m. and 3 a.m., working the graveyard shifts that no one else wanted, returning to her 2009 Honda Civic parked in a lot behind the community center, where security did not check on sleeping cars, and trying to sleep in the front seat without attracting attention. On cold nights, she ran the engine to keep warm. This cost gas money, which reduced her daily income. On hungry nights, she ate the leftovers from failed orders or food that customers sent back. This kept her alive but made her feel like something less than alive. On nights when she could afford a motel room, roughly twice per month, she locked the door and cried quietly so no one would hear. The waitress refilled her water glass without being asked. Mia mouthed a thank you. 3 days from now, she would be standing in front of a food delivery at the gates of a mansion she had never heard of, working a shift she did not expect to change her life, in a moment she could not yet imagine. But tonight, in this diner, at 3:22 in the morning, Mia Morales simply sat with her $5 and her foreclosure notice and her photograph of 2 babies she could not reach, and she tried to figure out how to survive the next 72 hours. The diner hummed around her, indifferent and vast and utterly, completely empty of mercy. The fluorescent lights hummed their tired song, a sound like insects trapped in glass, and Mia Morales sat alone in the corner booth of Lucia's diner with her hands shaking in a way she could no longer control. 3:22 in the morning. The only customer in a space that smelled of burned coffee and grease that had been reheated so many times it had turned into something without a name. The black and white checkered floor stretched beneath her feet like a chessboard where all the pieces had already fallen, and the red vinyl booth seat cracked under her weight with a sound that seemed to echo in the emptiness. She held 2 things in her trembling hands. In her right hand, a crumpled foreclosure notice, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded 100 times, corners worn transparent. $85,000 owed in 72 hours. 3 days. The number had stopped feeling real 3 weeks ago and had transformed instead into something like a blade wrapped in ice, something that cut deeper the longer you held it. In her left hand, 5 $1 bills. $5. She had counted them 4 times tonight, as if the act of counting might change the mathematics of her own destruction. $5 to her name. Everything else was ash. Everything else was gone. Rosa, the owner of Lucia's, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face smooth, approached with a pot of coffee Mia had not asked for. Rosa's movements were practiced and kind, the kind of kindness that came from asking no questions and expecting no explanations. She refilled the water glass instead, ice clinking softly against the sides. "Honey, you okay?" Rosa's voice was like honey itself, thick and golden and too good for a place like this at an hour like this. Mia tried to smile. The muscles in her face would not cooperate. They had forgotten how. "Just tired," she said, and the words came out barely a whisper, like something breaking apart as it left her throat. Rosa nodded, the way people do when they have learned not to push. She withdrew, her footsteps fading toward the kitchen where the grill still hissed like something wounded. The photograph was in her wallet. Mia pulled it out with the same reverence someone else might pull out a prayer card, and there they were. Maya and Lucas. 3 years old and 5 years old, their faces pressed together for the camera, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said. That was 8 months ago. 8 months since she had held them. They lived with her sister now in Arizona. In Tempe, in an apartment with air conditioning and a refrigerator that stayed full and a bedroom with walls that did not vibrate when trucks passed. Her sister, Catherine, had taken them in when Mia had nothing left, when the shelter burned down, when the world had finally finished collapsing and there was nothing left to do but let her babies go. She remembered that morning 2 weeks ago with the kind of clarity that comes from trauma, when every detail etches itself into your brain with a permanence you never wanted. The shelter on Mission Street, where she and 47 other people had been sleeping on donated cots and army blankets. The smell of smoke that came without warning, smoke so thick it turned day into midnight. Screaming, which was the sound of people who still had hope that escape was possible. She had made it out with one thing. Just one. The photograph, pulled from her backpack as the flames reached the corner where she had been sleeping. Everything else, her documents, her ID, her children's birth certificates, the clothes that were not on her body, had turned to ash and then to nothing. Derek Collins had done it. She knew with a certainty that lived in her bones. Her ex-boyfriend, the man who had broken her wrist twice, who had put a cigarette out on her shoulder, who had convinced himself that her body was a territory he owned and could mark as he pleased. Derek, who could not accept that she had left him, who could not accept that she had chosen sleeping in her car over living beneath his fists. The police came. They asked questions in voices that suggested they already knew what the answer would be. Derek's family had money. His father was a lawyer. His mother was on the board of 3 charities. When Mia told them what she knew, the officers exchanged a look that meant they had already decided not to believe her. No one saw him set the fire. No one had proof. No one had ever heard Derek Collins threaten anything specific enough that it could be written down as a threat. What they had was a woman with no home, no ID, no documents, and therefore no legal standing to accuse anyone of anything. She had lost her babies that morning, though not to fire. She had lost them to the machinery of a system that ground up people like her and turned them into nothing. The nights after the shelter burned were the worst. Winter in San Francisco means 45 degrees and rain that cuts like needles, and Mia had spent those nights in her 2009 Honda Civic, a car that was worth approximately $3,000, parked in a lot behind the community center where security was lax and sleeping cars attracted no particular attention. She ran the engine for heat because the alternative was freezing, and running the engine cost gas money, which reduced the amount she could save, which meant staying deeper in debt, which meant sinking further, which meant drowning more slowly. On nights when she could afford it, roughly twice per month, if she worked every available shift, she got a motel room. She locked the door in those rooms and she cried. She cried quietly so no one would hear her through the walls. She cried into the stiff motel pillows until there were no more tears, and then she lay in the dark and felt nothing, which was somehow worse than the crying. She had tried to get help. Child Protective Services told her that her living situation made her ineligible for custody. She needed a home address. She needed stable employment. She needed documents she did not have because those documents had burned. She needed to complete a parenting class, which cost $240. She needed to pass a psychological evaluation, which cost $400. She needed proof of income, which required tax returns she had never filed because she worked cash jobs. The system was designed by people who had never lost everything. It operated under the assumption that people like Mia could simply start over, that there was some official button they could press, some form they could fill out, and the world would reset. But the world did not reset. The world just ground on, indifferent and vast and utterly empty of mercy. Mia had begun doing delivery work. DoorDash, Postmates, Uber Eats, anything that would pay her cash at the end of a night without asking questions. The gigs paid between $4 and $8 per delivery, and she could do maybe 5 to 8 deliveries in a night, depending on demand. $40 to $60 per shift. But that was before gas, before the wear on her car, before the accident that happened last month when she was so tired she drove through a red light and hit a telephone pole. The car still ran, but there was a dent on the passenger side that made a sound like wind whenever the window was open. Rosa paid better than the apps. $50 to $70 a night for graveyard shift delivery work from the restaurant, cash in hand at 3 a.m. when Mia clocked out. But even that was not enough. Her phone lit up. A notification from DoorDash. A delivery order placed at 11:43 p.m., just confirmed. A restaurant in Pacific Heights. That was money. That was her phone vibrating with the possibility of survival. She had to take it. She could not afford not to take it. Mia slid the $5 and the foreclosure notice back into her wallet along with the photograph of her babies. The corners of the photograph had begun to fray from being removed and replaced so many times. She had memorized their faces in a way that suggested she knew she might forget them, which meant that some part of her had already begun accepting loss as a permanent condition. She stood. Her legs moved beneath her in the automatic way of bodies that have learned not to ask permission before moving. The diner door chimed as she opened it, a small bright sound that cut through the humming fluorescent lights like a blade through butter. The November night outside was cold and moving, the air carrying the ocean smell of San Francisco at 3 a.m, salt and fog and the distant sound of foghorns that echoed across the water like something mourning. She had no idea that across the city, in a mansion in Pacific Heights with marble floors and a chandelier that cost more than her car, Giovanni Russo's daughter would wake from her bed in exactly 4 hours and slip past her nanny with a kind of determined silence that only a 6-year-old child could manage. She had no idea that her next delivery would be to that same neighborhood. She had no idea that everything was about to change. Mia Morales walked toward her Honda Civic, parked 2 blocks away, and she thought about nothing at all. She had learned that thinking only made things worse. The November night pressed down on Pacific Heights like a stone. Frost formed on the windshields of parked Mercedes and Tesla sedans, each one worth more than the house where Mia Morales had grown up. The temperature had dropped to 34 degrees, and the wind carried that specific San Francisco cold that cut through clothing and found the spaces between ribs. Mia's Honda Civic climbed the steep hills with a sound like an engine pleading. The delivery app on her phone glowed at 11:58 p.m. Pacific Heights Restaurant. Estimated delivery time, 5 minutes. The payout would be $12, plus whatever tip a wealthy customer might leave. $12. She ran the mathematics in her head the way she always did. $12 plus the $5 in her wallet equaled $17. $17 could become a meal. A meal could become the strength to work tomorrow. Tomorrow could become the next day. She had learned to live in these small arithmetic mercies. She turned onto Divisadero Street and the houses began to transform around her. Not gradually, but all at once, as if she had crossed an invisible border between 2 worlds. Mansion after mansion rose from the hillside like statements of permanent victory. Limestone facades. Iron gates. Security cameras mounted on corners like watching eyes. Windows glowed with warm light from inside, light that suggested people eating dinner without calculating whether they could afford tomorrow's breakfast. The delivery sat in her passenger seat in a cardboard container. Salmon fillet. Risotto. A dessert she could not afford to look at directly. She had stopped eating the food she delivered months ago, had stopped tasting what she carried to other people's tables. It felt like a violation somehow, like stealing a moment of their abundance. The streets were nearly empty. A few dog walkers. A woman in a cashmere coat hailing a cab. Mia drove slowly, checking addresses. 14 Presidio Terrace. 15. 17. The numbers were climbing like a countdown to something. 22. She pulled the car to the curb 2 blocks short of the address, as she always did. The app showed the restaurant was getting ready to close. If she delivered late, they would dock her pay. But something made her pause. Something in the quality of the silence on this particular street. That was when she saw the small figure. A child stood on the sidewalk, perhaps 2 blocks down, silhouetted against the streetlight. Pink pajamas. Bare feet. The sight of it seemed impossible, like seeing a photograph from someone else's life projected onto the street in front of her. Mia's car door opened before her mind finished forming the question of why she was opening it. The cold hit her immediately, a physical force that made her breath visible in front of her face. She moved toward the figure, her delivery uniform too thin, her body already burning through the last of its energy reserves. As she got closer, she could see the child's shoulders shaking. Not from the cold alone, though the cold was doing its work. The girl was crying, actually sobbing, the kind of crying that comes from being completely lost in a way that goes beyond geography. "Sweetheart." Mia knelt down, her knees cracking from nights of sleeping in her car. The child was 6 years old, maybe 7. Dark curling hair. Eyes that had been crying so hard they had swollen into slits. "Where are your parents?" The girl could not speak. The sobs came in waves, each one seeming to cost her something essential. Mia could see goosebumps rising on the girl's exposed skin, could watch in real time as the cold began to move deeper into her body. Mia unzipped her own coat, the only warm thing she owned, a Goodwill jacket she had found 2 winters ago and treated like it was made of silk. She wrapped it around the girl's shoulders and then sat down beside her on the frozen concrete of the curb. The cold rose through her body immediately, but she did not move away. "Okay, baby. Okay. You're safe now," Mia said, and something in saying it made her voice break slightly. "We'll find your family. I promise." The girl leaned against her, and Mia could feel how small she was, how her body seemed almost weightless with terror and cold. The girl whispered something that was barely audible. "What did you say, sweetheart?" "I want my mama," the child whispered. "I want my mama and she's not here." Mia's chest contracted so violently she thought for a moment she might not be able to breathe. She pulled her phone from her pocket with shaking hands and dialed 911. The voice that answered was professional and distant. "There's a child," Mia said. "About 6 years old. Alone on the street in Pacific Heights. She's hypothermic. She needs help." She gave the address. The dispatcher promised an ambulance in 6 minutes. But the ambulance did not arrive first. 2 black SUVs turned onto the street from opposite directions simultaneously, moving with a kind of coordination that suggested they had rehearsed this exact scenario many times. They stopped, and men in dark suits emerged like they were rising from the ground itself. The first man was tall, with a scar running from his left eye to his jawline. The second man was broader, with a neck like a tree trunk and hands that looked like they had broken other hands professionally. "Step away from the girl. Now." The scarred man had a gun visible at his hip, not hidden, not apologetic. Just visible. Just a statement of fact. Mia stood slowly, keeping her body between the man and the child. She was alone. I was keeping her warm. I called 911. The second man, the broader one, pulled a radio from his jacket. When he spoke, his voice was low. "Boss, we found her. She's with a delivery driver. Female. No apparent threat." The radio crackled. A voice came through, deep and solid like an oath spoken in stone. "Bring them both. Now." The girl reached for Mia's hand. Mia took it, felt how cold the small fingers had become. They were placed in the back of the second SUV, and as the vehicle moved through the city, Mia could feel the weight of what was happening settling around her shoulders like something that had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. The radio voice. The coordination. The way the 2 men moved like they had been trained in violence the way other people are trained in arithmetic. Mia had never been in a car like this. She had never seen a house like the one they were driving toward. The Russo estate emerged from behind black iron gates like a threat dressed in marble. 3 stories. Columns that looked classical, expensive, designed by someone who charged a great deal of money to make buildings look permanent. Security lights illuminated the manicured grounds. A fountain in the center courtyard. A driveway that could fit 20 cars. They were brought inside through a side entrance. The scarred man, Tony, she heard Enzo call him, escorted them through a hallway lined with paintings that looked old enough to be in museums. Emma, the child said her name was Emma, clung to Mia's hand so tightly it cut off the circulation in her fingers. The office was dark wood and leather and the kind of quiet that only comes from rooms that cost significant money to soundproof. Behind an imposing desk sat a man. Giovanni Russo was 47 years old and looked like he had been carved from something harder than bone. He was tall, over 6 feet, with the kind of broad shoulders that suggested he had not always been behind a desk. His suit was black and tailored so precisely it must have cost more than a month of Mia's rent. His hair was dark, silvered slightly at the temples. And his eyes were the color of a storm sky, and they held the kind of intensity that suggested he rarely blinked. He stood when Emma walked in. Everything about his body language changed. The hardness melted into something that looked almost human. He dropped to his knees so that he was at the child's eye level. "Baby, what happened? Why did you leave your room?" His voice, when he spoke to her, was nothing like it had sounded over the radio. It was gentle, terrified, utterly transformed. Emma's sobs returned in full force. "I wanted to see the stars. Mama used to show me the stars from my window, and I wanted to see them like she saw them, so I went outside, and I was looking, and I could not find them, and then I could not find the house." Giovanni pulled her against him, and for a moment Mia saw something that the suits and the scar and the throne-like chair could not conceal. She saw a father who was broken by the fact that his child had been out there alone, breathing in the December cold, lost and terrified. His eyes moved to Mia. Really looked at her, the torn delivery uniform, the cuts on her face from glass she did not remember encountering, the Goodwill jacket still wrapped around Emma's shoulders. "What is your name?" His voice had returned to its normal register. Calm. Controlled. Dangerous. "Mia Morales," she said. Her own voice sounded very small. "You probably saved her life, Mia Morales." It was 34 degrees out there. Hypothermia sets in quickly with children. He stood, keeping one hand on Emma's shoulder. He looked at Enzo. "Pay her $500. Enzo reached into his jacket and removed a stack of cash that seemed impossibly thick. He counted out bills onto the dark wood desk. 5 $100 notes. More money than Mia had seen in 6 months. More money than she had ever held in her hands at the same time. "For your trouble," Giovanni said. It was not a question. It was not even particularly kind. It was simply a statement of transaction. But then he added something else. "And thank you. For keeping her warm. For calling for help." Mia nodded. She did not touch the money. She could not move her hands. What she did not know was that Cordelia Blackwood had been watching the entire scene on security monitors from the mansion's east wing. Cordelia, who had been Giovanni's fiancée until she had betrayed him with his rival. Cordelia, who still owned a percentage of his restaurant business and came to the mansion often enough to believe she still had a claim on him. She had watched Giovanni kneel for a homeless woman the way she had never seen him kneel for her. She had watched Emma cling to this stranger. She had watched him hand over cash without negotiation. And Cordelia Blackwood had made a decision. The next evening, Mia returned to Pacific Heights. The delivery app had pinged her phone at 7 p.m., another order from the same mansion. The same restaurant. The same salmon, different risotto. The payout would be $18. She had climbed the hills in her Civic, past the gates, toward the address that was beginning to feel less like a destination and more like a gravitational pull. She parked in the circular driveway. The evening was clear and cold and beautiful in the way that only San Francisco evenings can be beautiful. She removed the delivery from the thermal bag. Walked toward the front entrance. She did not see the black sedan parked 2 blocks away. She did not know about the pressure plate installed beneath her car's fuel line at 3 a.m. the night before. She did not understand that Cordelia Blackwood had made a single phone call to a man named Derek Collins, and that one phone call had set into motion a sequence of events that would either destroy everything or transform it completely. She was simply carrying dinner to a mansion where a small child had begun to look at her like she might be a person worth staying for. The night air smelled like the ocean and the distant fog. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. The fountain in the courtyard ran with water that caught the light and threw it back upward. Mia Morales, carrying salmon and risotto, had no idea that in approximately 16 hours, the world as she understood it would cease to exist. She only knew that Emma had called her name from the window as she arrived. And she had answered. The morning light broke across San Francisco like shattered glass. Giovanni Russo stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Pacific Heights mansion, watching the city wake below him, and he did not yet know that his world was about to collapse and rebuild itself into something unrecognizable. His phone rang at 6:47 a.m. Tony's voice came through tight and controlled, the way it only came through when something had gone catastrophically wrong. Don Giovanni. Your mother. There's been an incident. The words hit like a blade through butter. Giovanni's hand tightened against the phone. Where? St. Mary's Hospital. The car bomb was triggered at 6:32 this morning when she started the engine. She's alive. Conscious. Angry. But Giovanni, whoever did this, wanted her dead. The world did not make a sound. The city continued its mourning beneath him. Cars moved. People walked. And in the spaces between heartbeats, Giovanni Russo's face transformed into something harder than stone, something colder than the ocean that surrounded the city. He did not ask how long she would live. He did not ask about her injuries. He asked one question, who? That's why I'm calling. We need to investigate. But sir, there's something else. The delivery girl. Mia. She was supposed to drive your mother this morning. Your mother insisted on taking her own car instead. Last minute. If she had gone with Mia. Giovanni cut the line. He moved through the mansion like a man possessed, each step deliberate, each movement controlled. His men appeared as if summoned by gravity itself. Within minutes, Tony and Enzo stood before him in the study, their faces wearing the careful blankness of soldiers who have learned never to show fear in front of their commander. Find out who built that bomb, Giovanni said, his voice deep and solid like an oath carved into stone. Find out who paid for it. And find out how they knew my mother's route. I want names. I want accounts. I want everything. By noon, the answer arrived with the precision of an executioner's blade. The bomb maker had been arrested 3 years prior, had spent 18 months in federal custody, and had given up his client immediately when offered a plea deal. The client's name appeared in financial records as clearly as blood on snow. Cordelia Blackwood. $50,000 transferred in 3 installments. Cordelia Blackwood, who had once worn his diamond ring, who had once slept in his bed, who had once believed she was destined to rule beside him. The art gallery occupied 3 floors in the Marina district, all white walls and polished concrete and paintings that cost more than most people's houses. Giovanni pushed through the doors at 2 p.m., and the afternoon light fell across him like a sentence. Cordelia stood near a sculpture of twisted metal, dressed in a suit that probably cost $5,000, and when she saw him her face did not show fear. It showed hunger. Giovanni. Finally. Her voice was silk wrapped around razors. I was beginning to think you had forgotten how to visit me. You tried to murder my mother. Cordelia laughed. The sound echoed through the gallery like breaking glass. I tried to free you from obligation. Giovanni, we have wasted so many years. You can't prove anything, and even if you could, I have lawyers. I have judges in my pocket. I am untouchable. She stepped closer, and her perfume came with her like a predator's scent. That pathetic homeless girl playing house with your daughter is a joke. Send her away. We can finally be what we were meant to be. Giovanni's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. You tried to kill my mother. I tried to remind you who you are. A man does not play house with strays. A man takes what he wants and destroys what threatens him. You've gone soft. You have that little girl now, and she's made you weak. But I can fix that. I can make you remember. Get out of my city." Cordelia smiled. "Or what? You'll kill me? You're not that man anymore, Giovanni. That man died when you decided to be a father instead of a king." She walked past him, her heels clicking against the concrete like a countdown timer. Giovanni did not watch her leave. He simply stood there, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, and he made a single phone call to a man in the Federal Bureau of Investigation who owed him a favor earned 15 years prior. That same afternoon, Mia went to retrieve her few belongings from the staff parking garage. She had 3 days before she would need to make a decision about staying or leaving, 3 days before Emma would ask why Mia wasn't there anymore, 3 days before her own heart would break into pieces too small to reassemble. The fluorescent lights in the garage hummed their mechanical song. Her car sat in the same spot where she had parked it that morning, unremarkable and small and utterly alone. Derek Collins stepped from behind a concrete pillar. Mia's body recognized danger before her mind did. Every muscle tensed. Every nerve fired warnings up her spine like sirens. Derek was larger than he had been 6 months ago, harder in the shoulders and jaw, and his eyes held the particular madness of a man who had nothing left to lose except his obsession. "Did you really think you could just disappear?" His voice was smoke and acid. "Did you think you could move into some mansion and forget about me? About us?" Mia backed away. "Derek, I don't want any trouble. I just want to get my things and go." "You don't get to go." He moved fast, faster than she could run, and his hand closed around her wrist like a trap closing. He slammed her against the concrete wall, and pain exploded through her shoulder blade, white hot and consuming. I told you what would happen if you left. If I can't have you, no one can." His other hand moved. The knife came up, blade catching the fluorescent light. The blade was long. The blade was sharp. The blade looked like the end of everything. A gunshot split the air. Derek's shoulder erupted in a spray of red. He screamed, a sound of pure animal agony, and his grip on Mia's wrist released. He dropped to the concrete floor, still screaming, and his blood pooled around him like spilled wine. Tony and Enzo stood with weapons drawn, their faces blank as executioners. They moved toward Derek without hurry or hesitation. They dragged him away still screaming, his body leaving a trail across the garage floor, and Mia remained pressed against the wall, shaking as if the cold could somehow reach inside her and stop her heart. That night, she could not sleep. The mansion was silent at 2 in the morning, the kind of silence that only exists in spaces too large and too empty. Mia stood in the garden, where frost had gathered on the stone and turned everything silver. The December sky stretched above her, stars sharp as diamonds, and she was shaking in a way that no coat could fix. She thought about Derek's knife. She thought about what would have happened if Tony and Enzo had arrived 1 second later. She thought about the fact that she had brought this danger to Giovanni's house. She thought about Cordelia, who hated her, who wanted her gone, who had the power and the connections to make that happen. And she thought about her 2 children, 800 miles away, who needed a mother. Not a woman playing pretend in a mansion that was not hers. A mother. A real one. Present. Safe. Alive. She pulled out her phone. Her sister's number glowed on the screen. Her finger hovered over the call button. She would tell her sister, "Keep the kids. I can't do this. I can't be here. I can't risk everything for a family that is not even mine." "Mia?" The voice was small and sleepy. Emma stood on the stone terrace in her nightgown, barefoot despite the cold, her dark hair tangled from sleep. She was holding a stuffed animal and looking at Mia the way that only children can look at the people they have decided to love. "I had a bad dream. Will you stay with me?" Mia's phone slipped from her hand. Her tears came then, breaking open like a dam breaking, and she crossed the distance between them in 3 steps. She lifted Emma into her arms, felt the child's small body settle against her chest, felt the absolute trust that Emma had placed in her like a sacred burden. I'm staying, Mia whispered. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Emma's eyes were already closing again. Promise? I promise. The next morning, federal agents in dark suits appeared at Cordelia Blackwood's art gallery with warrants that covered every surface. They moved through the space like ghosts, seizing computers and financial records and photographs. By 9 a.m., Cordelia in her designer suit was being escorted toward a waiting vehicle, handcuffs cutting into her wrists. She screamed at the agents. She screamed at passers-by. She screamed at Giovanni, who stood across the street watching with an expression that revealed nothing. You did this. You will regret this. Do you know who my family is? Do you know what I can do? The lead agent, a woman with grey eyes and a voice like iron, read her charges with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Federal charges. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted homicide. Racketeering. Tax evasion. Financial crimes. You're looking at 40 years minimum, Ms. Blackwood. Cordelia's face went white. Not the white of innocence, but the white of someone watching their entire world burn. That same morning, Derek Collins was already gone. Giovanni had made one phone call to the Lombardi family, rivals who had wanted to expand into Derek's drug territory for years, and had simply told them, the neighborhood is yours. The Lombardis had arrived within the hour, and Derek's screaming had echoed through the warehouse for exactly 4 minutes before stopping. He was never seen again. By sunset, the news had spread through San Francisco like spilled ink. Cordelia Blackwood's arrest. The federal investigation. The attempted murder charges. Every news outlet ran her photograph beside her booking number, and her family name, which had once meant power and protection, now meant only shame and disgrace. Mia watched it all from Giovanni's study, where she stood beside him as he watched the world reshape itself. His face was calm. His hands were steady. You did all of this, she said quietly. For me? Giovanni turned to face her, and something in his expression shifted. Something that looked like grace. Something that looked like choice. I did this because they threatened my family. And you are part of my family now. He did not know, could not have known, that Emma had already decided in her small and immovable way that she was not letting Mia go. That she had already begun to practice calling her a new name. That love, in the ways of children, had already made its decision long before the adults understood what was happening. Outside, the city lights began to glow against the darkening sky. And in a mansion that had once felt like a fortress of loneliness, something had finally changed into something that felt, for the first time in forever, like home. 3 weeks had passed since the federal agents led Cordelia Blackwood away in handcuffs, since Derek Collins disappeared into the darkness he had created, since the city learned that Giovanni Russo's mercy was far more terrifying than his vengeance had ever been. Mia stood in the guest room of the mansion, folding clothes into a worn canvas bag, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to leave quickly. The room overlooked the garden where Emma played with the gardener's daughter, their laughter drifting up through the open window like a prayer. Mia had saved $8,000 working as an event coordinator for Giovanni's legitimate hospitality company, $8,000 she had earned with her own hands, not received as charity. $8,000 meant a down payment on a small 3-bedroom house in the Mission District, meant independence, meant she could finally petition her sister for custody of her children again, meant she could stand before a judge and say with absolute certainty, I have built something. I am stable. I am no longer nobody. The door burst open without a knock. Emma, 6 years old, her dark curls tangled from play, her eyes already glistening with the beginning of tears. Vivi, why are you putting your things in the bag? Mia's hand stilled. In 3 weeks, she had heard Mia, Miss Mia, and occasionally the tentative, whispered Mama when Emma thought no one was listening. But never Vivi. That was her daughter's name from before, from Arizona, from the life she was building back toward. I'm preparing to move, sweetheart, Mia said, keeping her voice steady. To the house your papa helped me find. Remember? The one with the blue shutters. Emma's lower lip trembled. Her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. You promised you would stay. The words came out barely above a whisper, each one a blade wrapped in ice. You promised. Mia knelt down, taking Emma's hands in her own. The child's palms were warm, sticky from the garden, real and alive, and breaking her heart with the weight of a single promise made in the safety of a moment neither of them truly understood. Baby, I can't live here forever. Your papa has been so kind to me, so generous. But I have to build my own life. I have to prove to everyone, especially to myself, that I can stand on my own. But I want you here. Emma's voice fractured like glass dropped on marble. I love you. Those four words. I love you. Mia had not heard them since Arizona, since before the foreclosure notice, since before Derek's fists, since before her sister took the children and told her not to come back until she had something to offer them besides trauma and desperation. She pulled Emma close, breathing in the scent of garden soil and childhood, and felt something inside her chest crack open like a door that had been locked for so long it had forgotten how to close. I love you too, baby. So much. Her voice broke. But loving you doesn't mean I stay. Sometimes loving people means letting them see that broken things can be whole again. Emma pulled away, her small face determined in the way only children could be determined, absolute, unmovable, incapable of understanding compromise. She turned and ran from the room, her footsteps thundering down the mansion's marble staircase like a warning. Mia heard her find Giovanni in his study. She heard Emma's desperate voice, Papa, tell Mia she has to stay. Please, please, please. The footsteps that followed were slow, measured, deliberate. Giovanni appeared in the doorway 15 minutes later, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Mia's first car had ever been worth. His eyes were storm gray and unreadable, but his voice, when it came, was soft as smoke. You're really leaving? Mia could not meet his gaze. She folded the same shirt twice, 3 times, the fabric becoming smaller and smaller in her hands. I have to. I have to get my children back. My sister won't give them back to a woman living in someone else's mansion. She'll think I'm unstable, that I'm depending on a man to raise them. I need to show her that I can stand on my own. Giovanni stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with a soft click. The sound of the lock engaging seemed to echo through the space between them. Then don't live in someone else's mansion. He extended an envelope toward her. The paper was cream-colored, heavy, expensive. Mia's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a deed. A 3-bedroom house 6 blocks away. The purchase price had been paid in full. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. The paper in her hand seemed to weigh more than 1,000 pounds. I can't accept this, she finally whispered. It's too much. It's everything. You've already. My daughter calls you Mama, Giovanni said, his voice cutting through her protest like a knife through water. She hasn't spoken her mother's name without crying in 2 years. But she smiles every morning because you're here. She practices saying your name. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what you've given her? Mia shook her head. You saved my mother's life. You brought light back to this family. You taught my daughter that there are people in this world who stay because they choose to stay, not because they have to. That house isn't charity. It's gratitude. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. It's family. Why are you really doing this? Mia asked, though she already knew. She had seen it in the way he watched Emma play, in the way he had learned to braid the child's hair on Sunday mornings, in the way his entire world had reorganized itself around the simple fact that Mia existed. Because I know what it's like to have nothing, Giovanni said. When my father died, I was 15 years old. We lost everything. Our home, our security, our future. I built this empire from the ashes of that loss, from rage and vengeance. But Emma is teaching me something different. You're teaching me something different. Their hands touched as Mia took the envelope. Skin to skin, warmth to warmth, the simple electricity of two people who had learned to live in darkness finally finding the courage to step toward light. The plane arrived on a Saturday morning. Giovanni's private jet descended through low clouds, and when the cabin door opened, Mia's breath caught in her throat. Her daughter first, Lucia, 8 years old, with her father's dark eyes. Then her son, Marcus, 5 years old, running down the stairs with the kind of unrestrained joy that only children possessed. Mia fell to her knees as they crashed into her, their small bodies colliding with hers like redemption made tangible. She was crying too hard to speak. Her hands shook as she held them, as if releasing them even for a moment would cause them to disappear again. "Mama, are you okay? Are we staying together?" Lucia whispered into her shoulder. "Yes, baby. Yes. We're staying together. Forever." The words came out broken, raw, real. That evening, the family gathered in the mansion's dining room for dinner. Mia and her 2 children. Emma in her velvet dress. Giovanni at the head of the table. Isabella at the other end, her silver hair catching the candlelight, her eyes shining with tears she no longer tried to hide. The meal was simple: pasta, fresh bread, wine for the adults, juice for the children. But it was rich with the kind of abundance that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with presents. Emma sat between her father and Mia, her small hand reaching out to hold Mia's fingers. Halfway through dessert, she asked the question that had been building inside her for weeks. "Can I call you Mama?" The room went absolutely still. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, San Francisco stretched out under a clear winter sky, 10 million lives happening simultaneously, and none of them mattering as much as this single moment in this single room. Mia looked at Giovanni. He nodded, his expression unreadable except for the moisture that suddenly glistened in his eyes, the first time she had ever seen him cry, and it was for a child asking for permission to love. "Yes, sweetheart," Mia said, her voice shattering like ice on spring water. "You can." Emma squeezed her hand so hard it hurt, but it was the kind of hurt that felt like healing. Later that night, after the children were asleep in their beds, Giovanni and Mia stood on the terrace overlooking the garden. Frost crusted the stone railing, and above them, the winter stars burned like promises no one had made but everyone desperately needed to believe in. "I never thought I'd feel this again," Giovanni said quietly. "Hope. Peace. Something that isn't about power or control or vengeance." Mia turned to face him. In the starlight, his face was almost unguarded, almost vulnerable, almost human in a way that the man she had read about in whispered conversations could never be. "I never thought I'd survive," she replied. "But I did. We did." He took her hand, and when he kissed her under the winter stars, it tasted like redemption and like beginning and like the understanding that sometimes the worst moment of your life is simply the last moment before everything changes into something you never dared to dream was possible. Inside the mansion, 3 children slept peacefully, and in the darkness of the city beyond, no one knew that Giovanni Russo, who had built an empire on darkness, had finally learned that darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only love can do that. If this story moved you, drop a like right now. Subscribe because we post stories like this every single day, stories of second chances, of redemption, of broken families becoming whole. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their lowest moment might be the beginning of their greatest chapter. And comment below, would you have trusted someone like Giovanni? Would you have had the courage to leave when staying felt safer? No matter how hard life gets, remember that after the rain, the sky clears. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.